Y vamos con nuestro último ponente de la mañana, aunque ya saben que luego todos van a estar junto al presidente para una mesa que va a ser una mesa que se van a imaginar porque vamos a estar aquí todos juntos. Bueno, ya saben que desde los orígenes Cámara Granada está con un empeño maravilloso como es la formación. Richard Gerver es uno de los mayores expertos mundiales en innovación educativa y precisamente aboga por adaptar las enseñanzas a las nuevas realidades. Es cofundador de International Curriculum Foundation, que ayuda a autoridades y centros educativos de todo el mundo a desarrollar nuevos sistemas de educación. Van a tener que utilizar petaca, ¿vale? Así que ya saben que uno español, el dos inglés, que no va a hacer falta. Así que disfruten muy mucho de Richard, porque esto va a ser la antesala del colofón que vamos a hacer de esa mesa redonda. Disfruten.
Hola, buenos días. That's it, that's all my Spanish. Do you have any idea how intimidating it is to follow Vittoriano, Juan, and the extraordinary Robert Kennedy Jr.? I was listening with real concentration to what the three of them have said this morning. And one question keeps coming back to me over and over again. What exactly is it that we are afraid of? Because we know this stuff, right? We know the impact of big data. We know the challenge of AI. We know that the world is destroying itself environmentally. This isn't new. We've known this for 10, 15, 20, maybe more years. We know that the responsibility for the future of the planet lies in the way we as a society live our lives and do business. Yet something keeps coming back to the fact that we're too scared to act. I was listening to the three speeches, thinking a little bit about politics. And I think the events of the last few years are linked to this fear. When you look, for example, at the election, and Juan will know there's far greater complexity than this, but when you think about the election of Donald Trump to President of the United States of America, one of his key messages to the American people was, don't worry, all this scary stuff's rubbish. There's no problem with the environment. There's no problem with the surge of the Asian economy. It's rubbish. It's a conspiracy, right? And in Europe, dare I say it, and thank God I'm still here. Frankly, I was looking at the date in my diary, thinking 31st of October, this is the 8th of November, I'm not sure I'll be allowed out. Thank God it hasn't happened yet. But when you think about Brexit, it's a very similar thing, right? What happened was the British populace were finding themselves living in increasingly uncertain times. Environmental shifts, the impact of the global economic crisis, changing everything, making everything deeply uncertain. And what happened was a group of very skilled communicators who were anti-Europe exploited all of that to say, look, if you want certainty, all we have to do is leave the EU. What is it we're so afraid of that no matter what we hear and no matter who we hear it from, we seem to hope that we hear a voice that will deny it all, so that somehow we can stick within our comfort zones? And if I'm honest, as a former educator, I think the challenge lies in the way we were educated and we raise our children. Because the education system in its mass form is predicated on training people to seek out certainty. We were educated to believe that if we put our heads down and we did what we were told through school education, through university and college education, and we answered the questions we were set by other people, we would be trained to seek out lives of certainty. We were promised, weren't we, that if we did what we were told in education, we would end up with good jobs and good pensions and jobs and careers for life. And what we've seen happen over the last 20 or 30 years is a shift, economically, environmentally, perpetuated by the global crisis, which has made all of that change. But we were not prepared to live in a world where nothing was certain. And so, as we come towards the end of these 2 days, I hope you'll humor me, because I firmly believe that if we don't focus as organizations and within education on creating cultures of continuous and powerful learning, we'll continue to live lives of fear where we do nothing. You know, it's a challenge, right? Some of you have been here for 2 days listening to some of the world's greatest experts talking about some of the most important social, economic, and environmental challenges we face. You know, what do we know about what our children are going to be inheriting from us? They're going to be inheriting a world where, unless we change the way we live environmentally, economically, and socio-ethnically, there is no future. Yet what are we going to do? We're passionate today. Some of you may well be activists, but my guess is, and I hope this isn't too controversial, most of us will go back to doing what we've always done in the way we've always done it. So how does that change? Well, it doesn't change from big conversations and systems and structures. It doesn't change from doing what we've always done. And you know, I may sound pessimistic, but actually I'm a complete optimist. I look at our children and I think they're remarkable. I think potentially they are the generation that will change the world. How many of you have children of your own? Can you just raise your hands if you have your... It's why none of you are in a hurry to go home, right? We'll all just stay here together. I haven't been home in 18 years. But my youngest child has just left for university, so this weekend I'm going home. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it, watching our own children and watching their friends, to see the potential of these remarkable young people. I tell a story, which I haven't got time to tell in full today, about my son. A few years ago, I went to his bedroom to collect him to get him downstairs for the evening meal. And he was playing on his PlayStation. And the reason I had to go to his bedroom was because he was wearing noise-cancelling headphones. So I went up to his room and I opened the door. And he was sat behind a bank of screens, like a villain from a James Bond movie. I'm waiting for him to turn around and go, "Ah, Father, I have been expecting you." And then I'm looking for the trap door. Anyway, I walk in, and he's playing on his computer, which doesn't surprise me. But what surprised me was what he was saying into the microphone on his headpiece. Because he wasn't speaking English. He was speaking fluent Russian. Now, this is remarkable. I mean, firstly, my first instinct was, oh my God, he hacked the US election. But that's another story. It's remarkable for a number of reasons, right? We're English. We don't speak foreign languages at all. Right? In any way, shape, or form. We just speak English louder and slower because we think everybody else is stupid. And he's talking fluent Russian. Anyway, when he finished his game, he turned around, and it turns out that he'd learnt to speak Russian by building a friendship with another person playing this same game who came from just outside Moscow. And they'd been playing this game together for 3 or 4 years. And as a result, they just absorbed each other's language. That's remarkable, right? How many of you could learn Russian without any education or teaching from scratch today to be able to speak it fluently? And then you take that to you see, my son is not remarkable. He's a normal teenager. And by the way, he is about to become your customers and your future employee, because he's just a normal teenager. How is your company equipped to exploit that talent? Just a thought. Right? He's just a normal kid. But then you see the game changers, and it's really interesting. I was talking before to a couple of people about Greta Thunberg. Isn't it amazing what that child has achieved? It's truly extraordinary. A 16-year-old girl who marched out of school in Sweden one day to protest about the environment is now, within the space of 1 year, the most iconic figure when it comes to environmental campaigning on Earth. It's extraordinary. And also, what's even more extraordinary is she has harnessed the entire world's young people. A 16-year-old autistic child has changed the way the world is talking about the environment. That's the potential of our kids. A couple of years ago, some of you, many of you will recall the evil that occurred at in Parkland, Florida, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where a gunman walked into the school and assassinated many children. And what did the survivors do? 15 and 16-year-old children. They created the Never Again movement, Never Again MSD, the most powerful anti-gun lobby in American history. And how did they do it? They used the power of technology and the internet and their social networks to reframe the entire conversation. That's the power of our young people. And why are they so powerful? Well, I think it's because they're not afraid like we are. They've been raised in a time of change and uncertainty. They've been raised in a time of digital revolution where to them it's not a revolution, it's oxygen. It's part of their lives. Now, I'm not saying we're not on a very dangerous tipping point, because like all things that are remarkable, if we squander that resource, if we don't nurture it and develop it properly, the potential for that generation to change our planet for the better may dissolve. And what we mustn't do is add the squandering of human resources to the squandering of the environment and environmental resources. And how are we going to do that? We can only do that through education, right? We can't just keep relying on systems and structures designed by people from our generation to change the world. This is not the way the world's going to change anymore. In the last 20 or 30 years, in your own walk of life, in your own profession, when you think about economic change, digital technology, the environment, how many of us have just relied on somebody else to design a system or structure? Here's a controversial thought for you. In my humble opinion, systems and structures change nothing. People do. And so we have to focus on the development of human beings. And that means maybe that we have to ask very strong questions about the future of society, but also in parallel, the future of education. See, my fear is, when we, as generations, talk about change, what we actually mean is efficiency. How do we just become more efficient at what we already do? When you look at most policies designed around education, the environment, the economy, we talk big. And then what we do is we get trapped into just trying to create systems and structures that make what we already do more and more efficient. Education has been trapped in this for 20 or 30 years. We've talked about education transformation for a lifetime. Yet when you look at the policy changes in education around the world, particularly in Western developed economies, all we've done is tried to make what we already do more efficient. And the truth is, the future isn't about efficiency, it's about transformation. The gentlest way of describing it is evolution. So we've got to move away from the silver bullets, and we've got to come back to look at a different kind of vision for our future. A while back, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to have lunch with Eric Schmidt. Many of you might recognize the name. Eric Schmidt was, until recently, the executive chairman of Google. You can imagine my preparation for lunch with Eric Schmidt. Because I'm an arrogant Englishman, I remember the night before, turning round to my wife, who has humored me for nearly 30 years, amazingly, and I said to her, how do I make Eric Schmidt, one of the most powerful business leaders on the planet, how do I make him relax at lunch with me? She slapped me. We went to lunch the next day, and I remember sitting with him in a restaurant in London, and we got chatting. And I asked him two things. The first was to kind of just create a relaxed environment, because I hoped that he'd be drinking wine. But he's from California, and his body's a temple, so he was drinking water. So I went for the question. The first question I asked him was this, and it was specifically around education and technology, but I hope you'll see the relevance. I said, do you ever see a time, Eric, where technology will replace the teacher? His answer was immediate and unequivocal. It also surprised me, because I thought one of the great leaders of one of the biggest technological organizations on earth would have an answer that was, yes, of course I do. He said, no, never. And I said, talk me through that. He said, Richard, technology is an extraordinary thing. It's a tool of democratization of freedom. It's remarkable. It is truly the greatest catalyst for change the world has ever known. But education is about the development of human beings. It always has been, and it always will be. And therefore, to develop human beings, you will always need high levels of human interaction. Now, I think that's worth thinking about, not just in terms of education, but also in terms of the way we manage, lead, and think about change in our organizations. That it's actually about the development of people. And that's the only way we're going to change the world. It's certainly the only way we're going to change education. So once we'd settled down, I asked him the kind of question that I have the privilege of asking people like him. I said, can you talk me through the greatest challenges you've ever faced at Google? And he said, yeah, sure. He said, when I started at Google, he said, I was hired by the founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, to monetize the business, right? These two genius young men who were deeply philosophical and brilliant technologists had created a way to democratize information. And that was their passion. Could they find a way to simplify the internet so that people would be able to have access to information? You know, their philosophical belief was that dictatorships control information. If you can democratize information, you can change the world. And in fact, many people have forgotten that the founding principles of Google were to organize the world's information, make it available to everybody, and by so doing, diminish evil. Now, he said, when I started, I arrived at one of the most exciting, dynamic places I had ever worked in my life. The place was an ideas factory. People were having informal conversations all the time. He said, I'd walk into a room and hear a creative director who had assembled a group of people around her talking about how can we map the world in images so people can visit anywhere in the world from the comfort of their computer. He said, and ideas like that change Google. They become Google Maps, and we build and we build. He said, the interesting thing is the greatest challenge I've faced as chairman of Google has been our success. He said, because the more successful we've become, the more the nature of our meetings have changed. He said, it got to a point where I was walking around the Googleplex, and suddenly I wasn't hearing about ideas to develop our vision. Organize the world's information, make it available to everybody, and by so doing, diminish evil. Suddenly the meetings were more panicked. They were about, have you seen what this Facebook is doing? Have you seen what Microsoft are working on? He said, and when I look at our really short history, what I realize is our greatest disasters have come when we've reacted to what other people were doing, rather than having the confidence to pursue the things that were based on our founding vision and values. Now, I think that's certainly true of education. Globally, we have become so fixated with what other countries are doing. We've forgotten to truly define what our vision and values are. And I would suggest humbly that the same thing is true of a number of companies facing the maelstrom of change in the world we now live in, where we become so swept away by being reactive to what other people are doing that the ability to truly be agile and to innovate is dampened. So, for example, in terms of education for Granada and the region, the first question you should all be asking is, what kind of young people do we need to drive our businesses forward in the future? And that should become the template and vision for the values of education development here. What we've got to stop doing is running around the world looking at the international league tables going, oh, Finland! And then going, oh no, not Finland, China! And then going, maybe not China, South Korea! What about Spain? What about Granada? What's your vision? What's your values? How are you as a business community, as an education community, as a charitable community going to work together based on a vision for what it is you want your young people to look like as human beings and build an education system that way? Let me see if I can help just a little bit. The OECD in 2013 produced a report that amazes me. No one ever seems to have read. It was the first global report into the links between education, skills, and employment. The research program talked to some of the most significant businesses around the world, some of the most significant NGOs, and some of the world's most significant education experts, asking those questions. What are the links and how do we move forwards? And I would suggest that this might be a good place to start. Have a look at the 5 key findings of that report. Number 1, and the most important and resonant finding of all, the countries where there is an over-reliance on the acquisition of formal qualifications are the countries where young people will find it increasingly difficult to get jobs. I don't want to say anything, but I would suggest that countries like Spain, the UK, and the US are in big trouble because our entire education systems are predicated on the acquisition of formal qualifications. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that educators, whether it's at school or university or college level, stop educating young people for the world beyond education, and they focus on making sure they get the kids through the academic outcomes they need to get them through. So all of the resource and energy goes into preparing children to take exams and tests at the expense of developing the actual skill sets young people need to be able to thrive in the world that we're going to leave them. The second one is the last time any report like this was done, which was about 50 years ago. By far, the most important skill set for employers were routine cognitive skills. The ability to master a task and do it over and over and over again as efficiently as possible. What the research in 2013 said, and this is, I'm sure, going to resonate for most of the people who run businesses in this room, that actually those routine cognitive skills are no longer that high on the priority list. By far, the most important qualities employers today are looking for in young employees are interpersonal skills. The ability to collaborate, to create, to innovate, to be curious, to problem solve, to be critical thinkers. These are the qualities that we need. So we have to build an education system that does that. We also have to make sure that people have the ability to learn, adapt, and change through the entirety of their lives, not just until they're 16, 18, or 21. This absurd notion that education finishes when we go through and finish at university is just ridiculous. Look how much we're struggling with the world we now inhabit because we simply don't have access to the training and development we need to understand the challenges we now face. We need education systems that are from birth to grave. We need everyone to have access to them. We need you as organizations to appreciate that professional development can't be any longer just about making your staff more efficient at the jobs they do, but broadening their horizons, their imaginations, their curiosity, and their experiences, because that's where the new solutions are going to come from the world's greatest problems. It's no accident that it's the kids of this world that are leading the charge to find the true transformations necessary to secure our planet's future, because they see the world differently. And that leads to maybe the final challenge here, which is we have to have a far closer link between the worlds of work and education. All of us have to work together to prepare the next generation for the future. You know that brilliant old African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, the people in this room, you're all the village. So here's a challenge for you. Don't go away from these 2 days believing you're just going to go back to your silo. I want you to think about what each and every one of you can do to transform education, not just at school level, but in your own organizations, to truly allow the people who work with you and for you to develop, to be able to be the resource that changes society. Here's a man I wonder if any of you recognize. Juan Verde will, because Juan invited me to speak at an event in Madrid in the summer of 2018, and I got the opportunity to talk with this man. This is Barry Barish. He was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics. So this is a very clever man, much cleverer than me. I remember, actually, when we were starting to talk to each other, I did that thing, you know when you don't understand something but you want to build a relationship, right? So I said to him, Barry, what did you win your Nobel Prize for in physics? He said, oh, for my work into gravitational waves. Now, because I'm only a primary educator, primary school teacher, to me, gravitational waves is a hair care product. But it turns out this man is probably the most significant scientist since Stephen Hawking. So I said to him, how did you go about recruiting your team? He said, well, that's a good question. I said, well, how many people eventually ended up in your research unit? He said, I think in the end it was about 128. I said, and how many applications did you have for becoming a member of your research team? He said, over 3,000. Now, he said they were all brilliant people, all of them. None of them had got less than 2 or 3 doctorates to their name. These people were not stupid. All of them were brilliant in their field. I said, so how did you go about sifting 3,000 down to 128? He said, well, actually, we asked 2 simple questions. The first was, nobody got into our team unless they had the arts in their background as well as the sciences. He said, I needed rounded people, and people that were focused on one discipline were no good to me because innovation cannot be about recirculating the experiences you've always had. Innovation has to be about challenging your own perceptions of what you think you know. And that's one of the other reasons why we're too afraid to really act often in society, because we default back to only ever hanging out with people who will keep us inside our comfort zone. How many of you, for example, employ people who drive you mad because they're constantly challenging you? And how many of you actually end up employing people in your own image because you don't want any form of conflict in your company? Huge challenge. Every company, I believe, needs a punk rocker. Every one of them. Everybody needs a disruptor. Everybody needs somebody in the organization who drives you crazy, right? The second question is probably my favorite of all time. Because I said, so what was the second thing you were looking for? He said, nobody made it into my team if they didn't have the ability to ask stupid questions. Now think about that for a minute. How many of the people you work with have the courage to ask stupid questions in meetings? And how many of them are so scared of looking stupid in front of their colleagues and their peer group that they'd rather only answer what they think's already in your head? We have to find a way to make future generations more, I'm just going to flip through this, more courageous. And maybe here's the challenge. So a few years ago, I got the chance to work with Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple. We're talking about innovation. Now, this man, truly, what a genius, right? One of my heroes. And I have to be honest, it was an embarrassing meeting. I was invited to speak in Saudi Arabia at a conference, and I was told that if I went, I would get the chance to have 5 minutes alone with Steve Wozniak. Now, the problem was I had time to think about this. I don't know about you, but if you know you're going to meet one of your heroes, I overthink things. To the point where even I practiced how I was going to say hello to him. I practiced on my son. My son thought I was crazy. But think about it for a minute. You know when you shake someone, like, you meet, for example, Robert Kennedy Jr., and you think, do I shake his hand? And if I shake his hand, how much pressure do I use? Because it was Steve Wozniak, and he's cool and groovy because he comes from the world of tech. I thought maybe shaking hands isn't the answer. Maybe a fist pump with a woo, maybe that's the... Anyway, I went for a handshake, not too much pressure, just the right amount. Practiced, I was ready. And the other thing I thought was, I've got 5 minutes in the company of a man who's changed the world, right? So I thought to myself, I've got time to ask him one question. So I spoke to my friends, and I said, I've got this 5 minutes with Steve Wozniak, a man who's changed the world. What should I ask him? Anyway, I practiced, and I got my question. So I got my handshake, I got my question. And the day came, and I turned up, and I give my speech, and then I'm being taken by security to meet Steve Wozniak. And I think I'm cool and calm and collected because I've got my hello and I've got my question. And a moment, I'm there, and I know that behind this door is Steve Wozniak, and I'm thinking, be cool, be calm. Remember the handshake, remember the question, everything will be fine. Anyway, the door opened, and there's Steve Wozniak. And the only thing that came out of my mouth was, oh my God, it's you! Now, in the next few seconds, I'm thinking, Richard, do not be an idiot. Control yourself. Right? You have got to ask this question. There are people at home waiting for the answer. So as I walked up to him, I thought I composed myself. Everything again, the question was at the front of my mind until our hands touched. And then it was like a short circuit. My mind went blank. I'm in the company of a man who's changed the world. I've got the opportunity to ask him one meaningful question. And all that came out of my mouth, and I can't believe I'm sharing this with you now. All that came out of my mouth was, can I have a selfie? But what made it worse was in the moment we both looked up into the lens on the phone. We both realized in the same moment that I was holding a damn Samsung. But and I'm going to finish with this. You're all looking at me now thinking, no. amazingly enough, redemption came because I got to sit next to him on the flight back from Riyadh to London. I was so excited. You should have seen his face. But we sat there and we got talking. And what he said to me fascinated me. Because he said, one of the things I feel is when the world talks about education, we get the conversation wrong. Because too often we end up talking about what we should teach our children. He said, and in my opinion, it's far more important that people know how to learn than we fill them with information. And I said, well, why is that the case then? He said, well, let me take you back to the early days of Apple. He said, when Jobs and I created Apple, we had no idea. We were just messing about in his stepdad's garage. And we gathered a group of friends around us who we met at computer clubs and we knew through word of mouth. And he said we were tinkering with transistors and we were making various bits and pieces, but the business got serious really quick because Jobs had this ability to get us through the door of major corporations. He said, and that meant we were going to have to hire people, and we were going to have to start to hire people we didn't know personally. So one night, he said, the two of us went out for a beer. And we decided to talk about the kind of people we wanted to hire at Apple. He said, there's a lot of rubbish written about Steve Jobs. Most of it's not true. He said, but that night he said something to me that really changed everything. Over the beer, he said, what was? We can't be a company that makes things. Because all we are is a company that makes things. In the modern age, and this was the 1980s, this company will cease to exist within 5 years. He said, we have to be a company that gives people stuff it doesn't know it needs yet. Now, the reason they talked about that was because of the kind of people they were going to hire. You see, they were in the valley, right, in the gold rush. The cleverest people on earth were heading to the valley to make their fortune. The greatest mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, they were all heading to the valley. They could click their fingers in any bar or coffee shop and hire clever people. So that night, they came up with the thing that would differentiate the people who were going to work at Google. A mantra, a promise. And it's the challenge I want to leave you with. Because like so many things Apple created in their heyday, on the surface, the mantra, the promise, is so incredibly simple. But you scratch underneath and you realize the unbelievable complexity of the challenge. And I think it's the challenge that we face in education, not just in our schools and our colleges, but through the leadership we exhibit in our businesses moving forwards. And here it is. The promise they made to each other was, at Apple, we will never employ anyone who needs managing. How do we as a society create generations of people who work with us and for us who don't need managing? Thank you very much.